Hey, how's everybody doing? This is Brian Easton, author of the autobiography of a Werewolf Hunter series, and this is Whiskey with the Werewolf Hunter. Thanks for joining me this evening. I'm going to continue, or go back to the bottle of Bullet Rye tonight. Now, I'm not here to promote drinking or whiskey, really. I had a Facebook ad get bounced because they thought I was promoting the product, and I'm really not. It's just a format, for us to get together and talk. So, to your health. So before we get started tonight, I wanted to share something with you. I mentioned before about how my first kiss, I guess, with werewolves was this comic book and record combination. It's a Marvel comic put out by Power Records back in 1974. It's the Curse of the Werewolf. And this was my first exposure, even before the Wolfman. This was my first exposure to werewolves, and I was hooked. I think I told you, my dad took this away from me when he would listen to the record because he heard all this stuff about curses and torment and the plight of the poor Jack Russell, who's the main character in this. He took it away from me because it was an evil thing, he thought, and that's how I came to identify the werewolf as an evil creature. Kind of worked out for me that way. So anyway, I just wanted to share that with you. So now that we have, let's go ahead and get started with the rest of the show. So one of the questions that I'm most frequently asked are about influences, and we've been talking about influences for the last couple of weeks. We started talking about my experience with the occult research, and then last week we talked about my experience outdoors with wildlife and such. But there's more to it than that, obviously, and we've talked about different authors and stuff that have been an inspiration to me. But tonight I want to talk to you a little bit about the evolution of Sylvester Logan James. Now, as I told you before, maybe a couple of times now, the actual seed for the character came from my father's hatred for werewolves. Okay, now he doesn't believe in them. It's nothing like that. It's just that as an idea, he despises it, and that was there and waiting before the character ever came around. Now, when I was 10 years old, my mom gave me a typewriter. It was summer, as I recall. I was, like I said, 10 years old, and she gave me this old beat-up typewriter. It still worked, and I took out a sheet of notebook paper and I started typing stories. Now, the stories that I first wrote were about comic book characters. I was very into Marvel Comics at the time, and so that's the kind of stuff that I wrote. I invented my own characters, which were clones pretty much of the ones that I liked. But as I went on, I began to get more creative and come up with things that were not just out and out rip-offs. And so on November 21st, 1978, the dad's notion, that hatred for werewolves that he had, took on a form, which presented itself, and this is why I remember the date, because it's the date that the first Thanksgiving Happy Days special ran, November 21st, 78. And on that show, in walks Ralph Malph and Potsy. If you're not familiar with the show, that's okay. But they walk in dressed as trappers. And one says, "I am Wolf Stalker," and the other says, "I am Bear Slayer." Now, for the longest time, in my mind, this was actually something that Lenny and Squiggy did on Laverne and Shirley. That's the way my memory recalled it. Shows you how fallible memory can be. I have learned that it was, in fact, Ralph and Potsy on Happy Days. So they come in, one says, "I am Wolf Stalker," the other says, "I am Bear Slayer." And right away, I think, what would be cool is if there was a vampire slayer and a werewolf stalker. So the character took shape. It was protoplasmic, but it took shape. So during that time, I was making my own homemade comic books, like I like I was, well, I didn't tell you that, but I was writing stories and I was putting them together as kind of stapled together pages to make my own comic books, okay? Now I'm going to show you this. Like 4 people have ever seen this, and now I'm sharing it with the world. This is a 10 or 11-year-old me's conception. I can't get this right. There it is. Vampire Slayer and Werewolf Stalker. It's a stapled together, handwritten comic book. Partially handwritten, some of it typed. And that was the first incarnation of Sylvester Logan James. Now, he didn't have a full name then. He was just the Werewolf Stalker. I figured he ought to have a name, so I figured something with silver in it would be good, so I just called him Silvo for short. And he was a superhero. He wore a silver suit, full head mask. He had some, as I recall, he had some weapons, but mostly it was him fighting with that silver suit. He was the weapon. And then Sonny Carroll, which was, of course, the vampire slayer of that duo, which I never really did much with, outside of those preteen comic books that I did. So, flash forward 10 years or so, March 1987, and I see the characters. I see Sylvester's face for the first time. I see Silvo's face for the first time. This is when he becomes Sylvester from Silvo. And I see his face because it's the first time that I see Lethal Weapon and Mel Gibson playing Detective Martin Riggs. And his character in that movie was so tormented and so crazy that I couldn't help but love it. And I thought to myself, that's what I want Sylvester to be. So, next stage of evolution goes forward. Now he has a face. Now he looks like Mel Gibson in 1987. Okay? And so, with that, I was very inspired by that. Kind of fleshed him out in my mind. I took him out of the comic books and put him into short stories, which I began writing all the time. And then when I say short stories, I'm talking about 4 or 5 typed pages. I mean, the very, very primitive, very amateurish stuff. But it was all, it was all grist for the mill. So I'm writing these stories, and it's the 1980s, right? So he wears sunglasses and he's got the cigarette dangling out of his mouth and he's a smart ass, and all this kind of stuff that you get during that time from the heroes. But with each adventure that I wrote, each short story that I wrote, the character steps forward and he becomes less superhero, more anti-hero. But like I said, he's still very 80s. The 5 o'clock shadow and the kind of a Don Johnson, if he lived in the woods, kind of a thing going on. So between 1989 and about 1996, I not only put together the stories that I had, I started compiling and writing manuscripts that I would 3-hole punch and put into notebooks. And between 89 and 96, I did 6 different unpublished manuscripts on the life of Sylvester and the things that he encountered. It would be nice someday maybe to get some of those in print. Some of those stories will go with me to my grave because they're just god-awful. But it was in those unpublished manuscripts that Sylvester became the character that we would recognize today. That was his basic training, I guess. That was his a big part of his evolution. So in 1998, 6 manuscripts under my belt and a vision for the character. That's the thing. I always had a vision for this character, this werewolf stalker. Whether he was in a comic book or he was in a short story, spouting off one-liners at bad guys and blowing holes in werewolves a mile wide. I always had a vision for him that he could be bigger and better than I had made him, and that's what I strove for. So, like I said, in 1989, I met my wife for the first time, and she told me. Of course, she read all these manuscripts, and she told me, you need to put this stuff together. You need to put the best parts of what you've got there, maybe the first couple books, put it together, and self-publish it. And she shows me this ad that she saw in a magazine for an outfit called iUniverse, which was one of the first print-on-demand companies. Print-on-demand is no big deal today. There's lots of different companies doing it. But back in '98, it was a new thing. No longer were you at the mercy of what they called vanity companies who would charge you thousands of dollars, and then you had to do your own legwork, and you had this 500 books in boxes you had to store somewhere and keep dry. They would print it and sell it as it sold, and it was cheap. It was like $180 back then to publish it. She's like, "You need to get on this and do this." And I'm like, "Yes, ma'am." So I got on it and I did it. And it took me a while. It took me a few years to get all that together the way I wanted. But when I did, what came out of that was the first edition of Autobiography of a Werewolf Hunter. Of course, when it was published in 2003, originally it was called When the Autumn Moon is Bright, subtitled The Autobiography of a Werewolf Hunter. When Bermuda Press came along in 2007, I think, they weren't interested in When the Autumn Moon is Bright. They just wanted the Autobiography of a Werewolf Hunter, and I couldn't agree more with them. So that's what we did, and that's in a nutshell. That's the evolution of Sylvester Logan James. So continuing on with the 10 fears, just to play catch up. This is an article that I wrote some time ago for a website called horrorwood.com. And I basically took the 10 classic, as I say it, the 10 classic movie monsters and assigned to them primitive fears of mankind. What about each one of these creatures frightens us on a deeper level than just the terror of them or just the horror of them. So tonight we're going to talk about a monster that doesn't get much press. He's largely unsung as much as he is unseen, and that's the Invisible Man. The Invisible Man is one of my favorite Universal monsters. He's one of my favorite characters from literature. After the Wolfman and maybe the Mummy, Invisible Man is right there. He's just very interesting, and he's so complex a character. More in the book than the movies, but we'll get to that. So the Invisible Man, you don't have to be a scholar to know that something that you can't see that is coming after you is scary. And this could embody the fear of the unknown, but the fear of the unknown is a very broad stroke, and under that you've got all kinds of different fears that it is the progenitor of. So of these fears, the way that I see it, the Invisible Man is an embodiment of our fear of the dark. Afraid of the dark. I mean, is there anything older than fear of the dark? Children fear it. It's one of the first things they're afraid of. Lights go out, can't see anything, I'm afraid. Because that ancient darkness, it conceals and distorts everything it touches. And there are terrors unseen behind that shroud. And, under its influence in dusky type situations, it starts getting dark and benign objects become terrifying. Because it gives our imaginations kind of an artistic license to come up with things more horrible than what is really out there. This mental terror, psychological horror that, where your mind plays tricks on you and you scare yourself. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've never been more scared than the times I've scared myself with stuff, The imagination runs wild. So if you look at it from that point of view, if you look at the Invisible Man as the fear of the dark, what happens when that fear of the dark is not just in your imagination? It's not just your mind running away from you. When there is a legitimate terror there, like Griffin, who is the Invisible Man, the fear becomes exponential, because not only do you have this unknown, because the Invisible Man leaves you in the dark regardless of the time of day, regardless of how brightly lit the room is. If you're facing the invisible man, if you're dealing with that, you're in the dark. You might as well be blind. And we are like blind people hiding from a demented killer who wants to do you bodily harm, and we can't see it. We rely on our eyes so much. It's the other senses just kind of fall in line behind it. We lose our sight, and that's it. Our big perception of the world, the big picture that we have of the world we live in, is gone, and we have to learn to use other things, as I've heard blind people say. So if you're a blind person locked in the room with a demented killer, that's scary enough. And when I say demented killer, I'm talking about Griffin. I'm talking about his being a sociopath. In the book and in the movie, he loses his mind. We're told it's because of the drug, that the serum that turned him invisible is also playing havoc with his mind and making him go mad. But I don't know if you ever noticed this or not, but the Invisible Man has like the highest body count of any of the Universal monsters on screen. You could argue Dracula's, hundreds of years old. He's killed countless victims, and that's all well and good. But on screen, I'm talking about, nobody kills more people than the Invisible Man. In the train wreck alone, in the original Invisible Man film, he kills over 100 people, just like that. So, he's a force to be reckoned with. His madness, his homicidal madness, is pretty much insatiable. He wants to rule the world, and he'll kill anybody that gets in the way of him doing it. So, like I said, we're told that it's the serum, it's the monocaine in the movie. They call it the monocaine that drives him crazy. But could there be another reason why an Invisible Man could lose his conscience? That he would be incited to this criminal behavior? Well, ask yourself these questions. If you were invisible, that is, if you had the power to disrobe and go wherever you wanted to, where would you go? What would you do? Who would you spy on? What would you steal? Who would you kill? Or at least hurt very badly, if nothing else. It's impressive to think about those questions, because there's an adage from the movie that Kevin Bacon did several years ago called Hollow Man, and it was a kind of a takeoff on the whole Invisible Man, and it was not a great movie, but the tagline from that always kind of stayed with me. It's amazing what you're capable of when you don't have to look at yourself in the mirror anymore. So this is the part of the show I like to call Let's Talk Shop. This is where we talk about monster hunting and monster hunters. And for the last couple of weeks I've been talking about the Legends of the Monster Hunter anthologies that were published first by Pill Hill Press, edited by my friend Miles Booth, and then Miles started his own company called MB Press, which published the subsequent 3 anthologies. And there's a lot of really good monster hunters in those, as I've told you. And so we've been talking about some of those. And this week I want to talk about a character that's a little offbeat. He's written by a writer named Tom Brannan, and Tom's a friend of mine, and he's a relentless and a very intuitive writer, co-creator of the Pavlov's Dogs series, and the author of such novels as Sad Wings of Destiny. The character that I want to talk about is named Yo, and it's spelled I-O. And this character appears in Tom's book Before the Dawn, which is available on Amazon now, which is a very interesting book, very complex and well put together world building that he does there. But Yo is a mage. Okay, he's a magician, an enchanter. He's thin and he's pale. He's kind of slight. He's got long white hair, and that's pretty much where any similarity to other wizards you may have heard of ends. He has an insatiable craving for junk food. He cusses like a sailor, and though he's well versed in the use of magic as he's been trained, he also likes to keep a .357 Magnum handy, just in case, you know. Now he's a centurion in the book Before the Dawn, and in a lot of the short stories where Yo appears. He's Centurion 9. He's 9 of 100 mages that belong to an outfit called the Century, and the Century is in charge of keeping the Great Pact, and the Great Pact is basically that humanity and the wizards, the supernatural realm, that is, should police themselves, and they're in charge of making sure that happens. So to this end, they have 100 centurions scattered throughout the world, and these centurions are wizards, and they keep the peace. And when they're not doing that, they're saving the world from major supernatural occurrences. Now, one of the really cool things about Yo and the Century and his whole Century project, Tom's whole Century project, is that a lot of it centers around major catastrophes in history, and how each one of these things, each one of these catastrophes ties in some way to a supernatural event that mankind was never supposed to know about. The Century came in and played a role in that, and then moved on. So Yo is he's a very streetwise, urban character, quite the opposite of my monster hunter, Sylvester. Think of him as Elric without the goth and without Stormbringer, and if Elric without the goth is starring in an old Jackie Chan kung fu comedy, that's kind of where you'll find Yo. But through Yo, Brannon delivers to us a very satisfying brand of urban fantasy. You'd have to go a long way to find a more original character than Yo. So, well done, Mr. Brannon. Your fellow monster hunters salute you. So, Amanda on Facebook had a couple of questions about the Winter Fox journals, and she was wondering about the snake creature in the visions that the character is having, and also the Spider Woman. Now, I'm not trying to give too much away if you haven't read this yet, but the snake creature is they call it a blood drinker, or in the vision, the werewolf calls it a blood drinker, and it is meant to be a type of vampire. But instead of having an association with the bat or the rats or any other type of night creature, this particular race of vampires, which has an Aztec root, has an association with a rattlesnake, and so it changes into a viper. And I think you'll see if you read, especially if you read the appendices of the Michael Winterfox journals, that the lineage is not exclusive to werewolves. Werewolves are definitely part of it, and they may even be the main part of it. But other creatures, such as vampires, are also, in essence, a part of the lineage. They're all associated with different creatures, whether be wolves or foxes in the case of the Japanese character at the end of the lineage, or snakes or spiders. Now, the spider creature, the Black Widow in the book, is actually I actually borrowed from an African story, and some of you who have seen American Gods know the name Miss Nancy, and maybe he goes by Mr. Nancy on that particular program. But Miss Nancy is generally what they called the Spider Woman, and she's a goddess for all intents and purposes. And I'm not saying she's not part of the lineage, or she is, but I borrowed it from the African legend, and put her in there, because at the end of the day, Michael Winterfox and his story is about more than just werewolves. That's a big difference. With Sylvester, his hatred toward the beast was the entire principle of his life. With Winterfox, it's a little bit different. It's not, it's not the same degree of intensity, but it's more of a heritage thing. And there are also more forces at foot in Michael Winterfox's life than there were in Sylvester's, or at least that he recognizes. And we'll see more of that as the Winterfox Journals goes along. And speaking of which, I had a contest last week where I said if you would name your favorite werewolf and put it at the bottom of in the comments sections, I would do a drawing for the Winterfox Journal's first book here, and I would personalize it and mail it out free of charge to whoever's name I drew. Well, not a single person took me up on that, so I have nothing to draw and nothing to give away this week. I'm going to extend it again, though, in the comment section, whether you're watching on YouTube, and please subscribe to the YouTube channel if you get a chance, because my goal is eventually to steer this Whiskey with the Werewolf Hunter away from Facebook exclusively and to make YouTube more of its permanent home. So if you don't mind, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. I post the link pretty often. So post your comments here on Facebook, or if you're watching on YouTube, put your favorite werewolf from fiction, from movies, from popular culture, and maybe there'll be more than one name to do a drawing next week. Somebody could have won easily this last week if there had been a single person put their name down. There would have been just the one name to draw. Anyway, until next time, this is Brian Easton, Whiskey with the Werewolf Hunter, saying good night.